Charisma, the dump stat of so many characters. An easy way to summarize the 3 mental attributes of Dungeons & Dragons characters is this. Wisdom is the way that information goes into your head. Intelligence is the information in your head, and charisma is the expression of information out of your head. But here's the thing that most players miss. Charisma is the only one of your 3 stats that requires an audience. Strength lifts the boulder whether anyone's watching it or not. Charisma only exists in the gap between you and another person. And that turns out to be key to understanding everything else about it. So today, we're going to go deep. We'll trace charisma from its origins as a hired help management tool in the original 1974 white box all the way through to 5th edition and beyond. We'll pin down what each attribute score actually means in concrete role-playing terms, what genuinely separates a Charisma 9 character from an 11 and an 18 from a 20. We'll explore what happens when supernatural beings push past the mortal ceiling entirely. We'll look at why a Charisma Bard and a Charismatic Rogue are doing something fundamentally different with the same stat. And we'll clear up some persistent misconceptions about what Charisma actually represents and what it doesn't. So, settle back, grab yourself a tasty beverage. It's time to get deeply nerdy, as this is the complete guide to the Charisma attribute. So, early days. How did Charisma begin? To understand where Charisma comes from, you need to go back one step further than D&D itself, back to the tabletop war games that role-playing games grew directly out of. Games like Chainmail, which Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin published in 1971, and which D&D was originally designed as a fantasy supplement for. In those war games, a leader was a distinct unit type whose personal qualities directly affect how many troops they could command and how those troops performed under pressure. A strong leader kept units fighting when they should have routed. A weak one watched his flanks collapse. Charisma, when it arrived in the 1974 white box, was that wargaming leader mechanic translated directly into an individual character. Nothing more, nothing less. Which is why it makes complete sense that it did exactly 2 things. Determined how many retainers would follow you, and set their base loyalty for morale checks. The vocabulary carries over. Morale checks in D&D are morale checks in wargaming. The same dice, the same tension, just zoomed in from a regiment to a party of 4 people and their increasingly nervous hired help. Well, this is why Charisma was never meant to be a dump stat in the context it was designed for. Lethal dungeon crawling where experience from treasure rather than combat. Your retainers weren't flavor, they were survival infrastructure. A high charisma character could field a small platoon, and that platoon might be the difference between surviving a 3rd dungeon level and leaving your character sheet in the rubbish bin. Understanding that origin also frames what charisma was measuring. It wasn't beauty or wit, it was that quality that makes soldiers follow an officer into situations they refuse to enter for anyone else, literally following them to the gates of hell. Perceived trustworthiness, authority, that unspoken conviction that this person knows what they're doing and that following them is the rational choice. That's a more interesting thing than a pretty face, and it runs through everything that follows, even when later editions lose sight of it. This carries forward into basic D&D, the next iteration, and the longest running version of the game, and I would say the most complete. The Holmes, Mulvey, and Mensa editions through to the Bull Cyclopedia, where Charisma gains its real first expansion beyond the wargaming roots. You still get the retainer system, maximum henchman, base morale scores ranging from 4 to 10 depending on your score, loyalty checks when the dragon breathes on the party and half the torchbearers consider a career change, but now Charisma also directly modifies reaction rolls. This is really significant. When your party encounters a monster or NPC, the DM rolls 2d6 and checks the reaction table: hostile, uncertain, neutral, or friendly. Your charisma modifier adjusts that roll. A score of 18 in basic gives you a +3. A score of 3 gives you a -3. And that's a massive swing on a 2d6 roll distribution. And it means a high charisma character could, in theory, turn a potentially deadly encounter into a conversation, or at minimum, buy time. The whole point of the reaction system was that not every monster wanted to fight, and your charisma was the primary lever for finding out that before initiative was rolled. This is also the first time charisma reaches beyond the party and starts doing something in the real world at large. The wargaming leader only needed to command the troops under them. The basic D&D adventurer now has a stat that actively shapes first impressions with strangers, enemies, and everything in between. Now, moving into advanced D&D, the first and second edition, the system elaborates rather than reinvents. The henchmen tables get more granular. The first edition gives us explicit numbers. A charisma of 3 caps you at 1 henchman with a loyalty bonus base of minus 30%. 18 gets you 15 henchmen and loyalty base of plus 30. The reaction adjustment scales alongside. These are serious mechanical stakes, not flavor text. First edition gives us what might be the most honest definition charisma has ever received in any official rulebook. Gary Gygax writes that charisma is the measure of the character's combined physical attractiveness, persuasiveness, and personal magnetism, and then immediately adds that a generally non-beautiful character can have a high charisma due to strong measures in the other 2 aspects. Even in 1977, the designers understood that charisma and physical beauty were related but not synonymous, and that the gap between them was where the most interesting characters lived. Second edition softens this further, explicitly pulling back on the attractiveness component. The charisma score measures a character's persuasiveness, personal magnetism, and the ability to lead. It's not a reflection of physical attractiveness per se, although attractiveness certainly plays a role. The stat is slowly moving away from the physical and towards something more like force of self, a process that won't complete until 5th edition, but which begins right here. There's also a note worth making about Unearthed Arcana, the 1st edition supplement, which introduced an optional attribute called comeliness, a pure physical beauty score, entirely separate from charisma. This was Gygax's attempt to restore the tension between presence and appearance by simply splitting them into 2 different numbers. It never really caught on in any mainstream way. I used it back in the day, but the instinct behind it was sound. These really are 2 different things, and conflating them creates confusion that still echoes in how players misread the stat today. But we'll come back to this. Then comes 3rd edition, and everything changes. 3rd edition and its revised 3.5 update is where charisma stops being primarily about what follows you and becomes primarily about what power lives inside you. The henchman tables are gone. In their place, charisma becomes the primary spellcasting attribute for bards and sorcerers, sets the difficulty class for their spells, determines their bonus spells per day, and keys an entire suite of social skills: bluff, diplomacy, disguise, gather information, intimidate, perform, and use magic device. That last one is worth noting. Use magic device is a skill that lets you activate magical items your class normally couldn't use, and it runs off charisma. The implication is quietly fascinating. The ability to convince a magic item that you are something you're not is a function of a force of personality. You're not tricking the item with logic, you're willing it into compliance. And this edition also introduces the leadership feat, which finally codifies what the old retainer system was gesturing at. Your leadership score is your character level plus your charisma modifier, and it determines the quality and loyalty of followers you can attract. The wargaming DNA is still there, just expressed differently. For paladins, 3rd edition makes charisma load-bearing in a new way. Divine Grace adds your charisma modifier to all saving throws. Lay on Hands heals scales with it. Smite Evil uses it. The paladin's charisma isn't social magnetism in any conventional sense, it's the mechanical expression of moral conviction. So absolute, it radiates outwards and reshapes reality. And that's worth remembering when we get to 5th edition. 4th edition is, well, let's be honest, a compressed chapter in this story. Charisma powers skills, again, bluff, diplomacy, intimidate, streetwise. and contributes to the will defense alongside wisdom. It's the primary stat for bards, sorcerers, and warlocks. The edition's focus on tactical combat and tightly structured skill challenges means charisma functions well, but loses some of the texture that makes it interesting to think about. It works, it's just not where the most interesting design thinking was happening. Then 5th edition comes along, and brings with it what is quietly the most significant mechanical addition Charisma has ever received, the Charisma saving throw. That addition is smaller than it looks on paper, and more significant than most role players ever realize. Every other saving throw in 5th edition maps fairly cleanly into a physical or mental capability being tested. Constitution resists poison, wisdom resists being charmed or frightened, intelligence resists illusion, but charisma saving throws apply to banishment, to possession, and to effects that attempt to sever you from your plane of existence or overwrite your identity entirely. What charisma is resisting in those cases is not a social challenge, it's an existential one. This is the edition that completes the journey that began back in 2nd edition. Charisma in 5th edition is explicitly the ability to interact effectively with others, grounded in confidence and eloquence, and a charming or commanding personality. Physical attractiveness barely gets a mention, but more than that, it's your sense of self, strong enough to resist being unmade. A character with low charisma isn't just bad at talking to people, they have a thin, easily overwritten sense of who they are. A character with high charisma doesn't just persuade NPCs, they are, in some fundamental sense, harder to erase. And before we move on, a brief word on Pathfinder, since it's impossible to talk about D&D's mechanical history without acknowledging the system that grew directly from 3rd edition's roots. Pathfinder 1st edition is essentially 3.5 with the rough edges filed down. Charisma functions almost identically, powering sorcerers, bards, paladins, and the indispensable use magic device skill. Pathfinder's 2nd edition streamlines considerably, tying charisma to deception, diplomacy, intimidation, and performance, and integrating it into a more action economy-focused framework. The underlying logic is the same, but the execution is cleaner and considerably less prone to optimization spirals that Pathfinder 1 charisma stacking was famous for. So, that's the history. Charisma began as a wargaming mechanic about leadership and troop loyalty, moved through social capital and innate magic, and landed somewhere its original designers almost certainly didn't anticipate: your identity itself as a measurable attribute. Holding on to that as we get into what the actual numbers mean. So let's talk about what those numbers actually translate into. Not the modifiers, the modifiers are easy enough. What we're after here is the qualitative reality of each score. What kind of person actually has a charisma of 8? And what does crossing into positive modifier territory genuinely change about how the world treats you and how you move through it? The role-playing. Because the answers are more interesting and more specific than most players ever dig into. And there's a structural detail worth flagging before we dive in, because it shapes how you think about every score on the scale. The modifier thresholds, the point where the actual mechanical bonus changes, happen at even numbers: 10 and 11, both plus 0, 12 and 13, both plus 1, 14 and 15, both plus 2, and so on. That means the odd number in each pair is mechanically identical to the even number below it. The dice can't tell them apart. So the interesting role-playing question becomes, if the mechanics don't distinguish a 12 from a 13, what does? The even number is the threshold. The moment a quality unlocks, where something new becomes available to the character. The odd number is that quality becoming settled, worn in, part of the practice. The difference between someone who has just discovered they can command a room and someone for whom commanding a room is simply who they are. Now keep that in mind as we go through each range. Let's start at the bottom. A charisma of 3, 4, or 5 is not simply low, it's actively alienating. This isn't a character who struggles to make friends, it's a character whose presence makes people instinctively uncomfortable in ways they can't quite articulate. Conversations just die. Rooms empty. People find reasons to be elsewhere. This isn't necessarily about appearance or rudeness. It can manifest as an unsettling blankness, an inability to read or respond to social cues that most people process unconsciously, or a quality of stillness or intensity that reads as threatening even when no threat is intended. Think less awkward at parties and more someone or something is genuinely off about this person and I don't know what it is. The instinct is to play this for comedy. That's usually the less interesting choice. The more honest question for a character at this score isn't how do I fail social roles, it's how has this person built a life around a fundamental disconnection from other people? Maybe they'll learn to work around it, written communication, intermediaries, letting their actions speak where their words can't. Maybe they've stopped trying entirely and wear their isolation like armor. At 3, there's no management of it at all. By 5, there's the beginning of a coping strategy, however crude. Scores of 6 and 7 pull back slightly from actively unsettling into something more like chronic social friction. People don't flee, they just don't engage any more than they have to. Conversations are functional but joyless. The character is one people describe as fine, I suppose, with a slight emphasis on the suppose. They're not threatening, they're just draining to be around in a low-level way that's hard to pin down. At 6, this friction is fairly constant. At 7, there are good days, moments where it almost works before sliding back into the baseline. At 8 and 9, we're approaching the threshold of average, and the texture shifts again. This is the range of the mildly awkward and socially clumsy, the person who is perfectly capable of holding a conversation but consistently fumbles the timing. Jokes land at a beat too late. Compliments come out slightly wrong. They say the true thing at the moment when tact would have been better. At 8, this is noticeable enough that people clock it. There's a faint sense of relief when the conversation ends. At 9, it's subtler. They might spend an entire evening with a Charisma 9 character and only realize afterward that something was ever so slightly off, without being able to say what. They leave people feeling faintly neutral rather than warm. Charisma 10 and 11, the 0 modifier range represents the human average, and it's worth sitting with that, what that actually means. This is functional social camouflage. These characters blend. They neither attract nor repel. In a crowd, they're simply part of that crowd, and most NPCs in most settings live right here. The difference between 10 and 11 is subtle but real. A 10 is someone who handles social situations adequately, who gets through them without incident but without distinction. And 11 has just enough extra sense that interactions feel genuinely comfortable rather than merely functional. They're still not memorable, but people don't feel faintly relieved when they leave either. Charisma 12, the first +1 threshold, and is where the first real unlock happens. Something about this character is mildly magnetic, not dramatically so. This isn't a room stopper, but people find themselves slightly more inclined to listen, slightly more willing to give the benefit of the doubt. They remember you after a short conversation. Your warmth reads as genuine rather than performed. This is the score of the naturally likable, the one who makes friends without seeming to try, whose social interactions consistently trend positive without anyone being able to say why exactly. Below 12, you're forgettable in either a neutral or negative direction. At 12, that flips. People remember you, and that memory is warm. Charisma 13 is that quality becoming natural. The 12 character might still be slightly surprised when people respond warmly to them, might still be finding their footing with this new social ease. The 13 character has settled into it. It's not something they do, it's something they are. And that settled quality is itself attractive, because there's nothing more socially reassuring than someone who is completely comfortable in their own skin. Charisma 14, the +2 threshold, is where social gravity begins. In any group that they're part of for long enough, conversations start orienting around them. People seek out their opinion. They set minor trends. There's an ease to their social interactions that reads as effortless, a natural instinct for saying the right thing to the right person at the right moment. You're not just likable at the score, you're someone other people want to be associated with, and that distinction matters more than it might sound. At Charisma 15, that gravity becomes a known quantity to others and to the characters themselves. NPCs who have spent time around them have already adjusted their behavior accordingly. There's a subtle difference that's developed, a habit of checking what this person thinks before committing to a position. The 15 character has probably noticed this and has some relationship with it, comfortable, uncomfortable, or deliberately exploitive, depending on who they are. Charisma 16, the +3, marks the entry into genuine presence. This is where the stat stops being about social competence and starts being about something harder to define. A character at the score walks into a room and the room responds. Not dramatically, there's no fanfare, but the energy shifts. People straighten slightly. Conversations pause. There's an awareness that someone worth paying attention to has arrived, even before that person has said or done anything. Mechanically, this is party face territory. In role-playing terms, it's something more specific than that. You're not just well-liked, you're someone whose approval people want, and whose disapproval they're careful to avoid. And that's a different kind of social weight entirely. The wargaming roots are showing again here, actually. This is leadership charisma, the quality that made soldiers follow an officer into situations they refused to enter for anyone else. And that flip side is worth playing into. At this score, a genuine anonymity becomes almost impossible. Being memorable is usually an asset, but not always. Infiltration gets harder. Enemies remember you specifically. People form opinions about you before you've done anything to earn or deserve them. Charisma 17 is that presence becoming authoritative. The 16 character turns head, the 17 turns heads, and people feel slightly accountable to them, as though being caught in a bad moment by that particular person would actually matter. The difference is that at 17, the quality feels established. People have adjusted to it, factored it in, built their behavior around it. Now, Charisma 18, 19, and 20, the mortal ceiling spanning +4 and +5 is star quality, and it works differently enough from everything below that it deserves its own treatment. At 18, something shifts that is difficult to articulate but immediately recognizable. Stories circulate before you arrive. People who have never met you have opinions about you. In your presence, others experience something that they describe later as magnetic, electric, or slightly overwhelming. A quality of attention that makes them feel simultaneously seen and uncertain. At this score, charisma and force of will start to feel genuinely synonymous. You don't just persuade people, you define the terms of interactions. You set the emotional register of scenes. Your certainty is contagious. Your disappointment lands like the physical weight. At 19, that quality has become so thoroughly part of the character's identity that it operates without effort. Social interactions arrange themselves favorably, and the character has probably stopped noticing it entirely, the way you stop noticing the hum of a refrigerator. The potential blind spot that creates is worth thinking about. At 20, the hard mortal ceiling in 5th edition, we're at the absolute limit of what a flesh and blood being can achieve through talent, training, or force of will. And here the burden of high charisma becomes an interesting thing to play as its advantages. Genuine connection is difficult when everyone in the room is performing slightly for you. People project their hopes, fears, and fantasies onto you rather than responding to who you actually are. There's a peculiar loneliness that tends to accompany the score when it's played with any depth. Everyone loves them, nobody quite sees them. This connection brings us back to the saving throw. A Charisma 20 character has a sense of self so thoroughly realized that it actively resists being overwritten. Which brings us neatly to what happens when you go beyond the mortal ceiling entirely. So what happens beyond 20? This is the territory of dragons, celestials, archdevils, demon lords, and the occasional player character who's made some very interesting life choices involving divine boons, wish spells, or artifacts that probably come with terms and conditions they didn't read through carefully enough. Below 20, charisma is active. You project, you persuade, you command. It's something you do. Cross that mortal threshold and the relationship inverts. The influence becomes passive. Others are already responding to you before you've done anything, because your presence itself is the action. The distinction sounds subtle. At their table, it's anything but. So let's move through the ranges again. Charisma 21, 22, and 23 is what you might call legendary presence. This is the territory of ancient dragons, powerful celestials, and high-level NPCs whose reputation has preceded them across entire regions. At this score, the authority, the aura of magnetism is no longer something others choose to respond to. It bypasses choice entirely, at least for a moment. The first impression isn't just strong, it's physically felt. A slight pressure, a heightened awareness, the sense of being in the presence of something that operates by different rules than you do. At 21, there's still texture of individual personality underneath the aura. Ancient dragons at this score still feel like persons with histories and preferences and grievances. The presence is overwhelming, but the character beneath it remains legible. You can still have a conversation with them in the normal sense of the word, even if that conversation is somewhat one-sided in terms of whose comfort is being prioritized. By 23, the legibility has started to blur. Others find it increasingly difficult to read this being as someone with flaws and uncertainties. The presence is too consistent, too total, which produces an interesting irony. The higher the charisma, the more isolated that being becomes, because genuine peer interaction requires mutual vulnerability, and at this score, the being is incapable of projecting vulnerability even when they feel it. Wherever loneliness exists at charisma has deepened considerably at 23. The mask and the face have become the same thing, at least as far as anyone can tell. Charisma 24, 25, and 26 moves into what you'd call archetypical command. This is a demon lord and archdevil territory, beings whose personality doesn't just influence the room but shapes the culture around them over time. Followers don't simply obey, they begin to genuinely reorder their values around the preferences of this being, because sustained proximity to something at this score is a slow rewrite of your priorities. You don't notice it happening, that's rather the point. At this range, the being's emotional state starts leaking into the environment in ways that don't require magic to explain, though these beings usually have plenty of that too. A demon lord in a good mood produces a court that is cautiously, nervously celebratory. That same demon lord displeased produces a court that is quietly begun identifying who in the room is most expendable before a single word of anger has been spoken. Nobody issued an instruction, the social architecture simply adjusted itself because everyone present has learned, probably at considerable personal cost, to read the weather. Role-playing interactions with a being at this score means recognizing that normal rules of social encounters don't quite apply. The being isn't participating in the conversations the way you are, they're the context the conversation is happening inside. Charisma 27, 28, and 29 is where we reach what the state blocks of creatures like Tiamat, sitting at a charisma 28, actually represents, and godlike as a descriptor is both accurate and useless. So let's try to be more specific. At this score, charisma functions less like a personal quality and more like a localized force of nature. The being doesn't persuade, they redefine what is persuasive. They don't intimidate, they redefine what is frightening. Their presence doesn't just affect how others feel, it affects what others believe is true, desirable, and possible. Weak-willed creatures in their vicinity may experience spontaneous loyalty, devotion, or terror without any deliberate action on the being's part. Simply because sustained proximity to a Charisma 28 entity erodes the boundary between what you think and what they think. A prolonged conversation with Tiamat is not merely intimidating, it's identity threatening. You walk away from it slightly less certain of your own values, your own priorities, and your own sense of what matters. She didn't do anything to you, she was simply present. Role-playing this, whether you're a DM voicing Tiamat or a player character who has somehow ascended to this range, means abandoning the normal social toolkit almost entirely. You don't construct arguments, you don't appeal to emotions. You state the way things are, and the weight of your charisma does the rest. Silence is as powerful as speech. The challenge is resisting the temptation to perform this with big speeches or dramatic declarations. Because a being at Charisma 28 has long since moved past needing to try. Underplaying it is almost always more effective than overplaying it. Charisma 30 is the domain of deities and cosmic entities, beings whose personality is not just a feature of who they are, but a fundamental force of the multiverse. A god of beauty doesn't have Charisma 30 because they are very attractive and charming. They have Charisma 30 because attraction and charm are things that exist in the world, partly because of them. Their personality isn't expressed through the world, it's a part of the world. Interacting with a being at this level is not a social encounter in any conventional sense. It's closer to a natural event. There's an overwhelming sense of scale, of something operating at a register your senses just weren't built to process. Mortals in this presence risk not just being persuaded or frightened, but losing the thread of their own identity temporarily. You forget for a moment what you wanted, what you believed, who you were before they walked into the room. For player characters who reach this range through ascension, artifacts, or divine sponsorship, the roleplay challenge is a genuine one. You're no longer fully legible as a person to mortals around you. Every relationship you have is now, to some degree, a relationship between a person and a force of nature. And forces of nature, however benevolent, are very difficult to be friends with. There's one more dimension of supernatural charisma worth discussing, and it's the dark mirror of everything we've just covered. Charisma as a resource that can be damaged, drained, or weaponized against you. Several creatures in D&D's monster ecology attack charisma directly. The Death Shrieker, the Chichimek, various fiends and undead whose attacks don't target your body but your sense of self. In the context of everything we've established about what charisma actually represents, drain is a genuinely horrifying mechanic when you think about it. It's not damage to your health or your memory or your physical capability. It's erosion of identity. Each point drained is a slightly thinner sense of who you are, a slightly more permeable boundary between yourself and whatever the creature is doing to you. At 0 charisma in editions where that was mechanically possible, the character doesn't die in any conventional sense. The body might still be there. The personality is simply gone. This is also why the dark speech feat from the Book of Wild Darkness makes a horrible kind of sense. It requires a charisma of 13 to attempt and inflicts charisma damage on the speaker. You're using the fundamental force of your own personality as fuel for corruption, and the cost is paid in selfhood. Every time you use it, there's a little less of you than there was before. Charisma drain, understood properly, isn't a stat penalty. It's the game telling you that something out there is eating who you are. A high score tells you how much presence a character has. It doesn't tell you what kind. For that, we need to look at classes. So the classes, specifically the ones where charisma isn't just useful but load-bearing, where your stat isn't a bonus to occasional social roles but the engine the whole character runs on. And the question worth asking about each one of them isn't just how charisma works mechanically, but where it comes from, because that turns out to be the most interesting difference between them. So let's start with the Bard. The Bard's charisma is a craft. It's learned, intentional, and disciplined, which tends to surprise people who assume Bards are just naturally charming. Some are, but the deeper truth about the class is that Bardic magic works through performance, and performance is a skill. You develop it, you practice it. The Bard with a charisma 18 got there through years of reading rooms, failing to read rooms, understanding why they failed, and trying again. Their social fluency isn't effortless, it just looks effortless, which is the whole point. This shapes how a Bard's charisma should feel at the table. There's an intentionality behind it. A Bard doesn't accidentally charm someone. They make choices about what effect they want to produce and work towards it. Bardic inspiration is the mechanical expression of this. It's not passive magnetism, but an active decision to direct attention and energy towards someone else's success. The Bard sees the party rogue about to attempt something difficult and thinks, I know exactly what they need to hear right now. And they're right, because reading people is what bards do professionally. The subclass shifts the flavor considerably without changing the underlying source. A college of lore bards' charisma is rooted in knowledge. They're compelling because they understand things, because their stories are true and their insights are sharp. A college of glamour bards' charisma is a fey quality to it, something that bypasses rational evaluation, goes straight to the emotional response. People find themselves enchanted before they decide to be. A college of whispers bard weaponizes the trust that high charisma generates, which is arguably the darkest version of this class. You charm people specifically because charmed people are vulnerable. The sorcerer class is almost the opposite. Where the bard's charisma is craft, the sorcerer's is inheritance. They didn't develop this power, it erupted. Draconic bloodline, wild mage surge, divine soul, shadow magic. However the flavor is framed, the origin is still the same. Something happened, or something was always there, and now there's this. The sorcerer's relationship with their own charisma is often the most complicated of any class, precisely because they didn't choose it. What does it feel like to have power that isn't the product of your own effort? To know that the force of your personality is at least partially a function of what's in your blood rather than who you've chosen to be. Some sorcerers, I would hope most, are entirely comfortable with this. They own their heritage and lean into it. Others are in some degree of conflict with it, aware that what people are responding to might be the dragon or the divine spark in them rather than them specifically. The wild magic sorcerer in particular has a relationship with their charisma that's almost adversarial. This power is real, it's theirs, and it's not fully under their control. The practical expression of sorcerer charisma at the table tends toward the instinctive and the emotional. Where the bard makes considered choices, the sorcerer reacts. Their magic surges with feeling. Their social presence has a raw quality that the bard's polish doesn't. Less controlled, potentially more overwhelming. The paladin is the case where charisma means something entirely different from either of the above. The paladin's charisma is conviction. The force of their personality comes from their absolute certainty of their commitment to their oath. This matters mechanically in a way that's easy to miss. Divine grace adds charisma to all saving throws. The aura of protection adds charisma to the saving throws of every ally within range. The paladin's charisma isn't charm or inherited power, it's the mechanical expression of a belief so total it becomes structurally load-bearing for the people around them. The paladin's charisma should feel different from a bard's or a sorcerer's, less about social fluency or raw power, more about the quality of certainty. High charisma paladins are compelling not because they are charming or overwhelming, but because they seem to know with complete confidence what is right and what must be done. That certainty is magnetic in the way that any genuine conviction is magnetic, even to people who disagree with it. Which means a fallen paladin or an oathbreaker has a fascinating charisma problem. The score doesn't change, the modifier stays the same, but the source of that conviction is compromised. And playing that honestly means grappling with what the charisma now represents. Is it hollow? Is it weaponized? Is it redirected towards something darker? The Oathbreaker Paladin with Charisma 18 is one of the most interesting character concepts in the game precisely because of that tension. Then the Warlock is the most ambiguous case of all, and deliberately so. The Warlock's charisma is the charisma of the deal maker, and the central question class never quite answers is who has the better end of the deal. The Warlock uses charisma as their spellcasting stat, which implies that their magical power flows through their own force of personality. But that force of personality is in service of a pact with something vastly more powerful than themselves. So is the Warlock's charisma genuinely theirs, or is it partly borrowed? Is the magnetism they project their own, or is it the shadow of their patron falling across every interaction? Different patrons' flavors push this in different directions. A fiend warlock might have charisma that carries an edge of infernal authority. People respond to them partly because something in the back of their mind registers that whoever this person is, they have powerful friends. A great old one warlock's social presence might have an unsettling quality that's hard to pin down. They're compelling in the way that something is deeply strange is compelling. drawing attention precisely because something about them doesn't quite fit. An Archfey Warlock might be the most overwhelmingly charming of the three, their personality carrying a glamour-like quality that bypasses critical evaluation. The Hexblade absolutely deserves special mention. The Hexblade Warlock has made a pact with a sentient weapon or the Shadowfell entity behind it, and their charisma takes on a martial quality, commanding rather than charming, with an edge of threat that most other high charisma characters don't carry. The Hexblade's social presence says, I'm someone you want on your side and someone you very much do not want against you. Now, there are two classes that share charisma investment but apply it in ways that are fundamentally different from each other. Different enough that they're worth putting side by side. The Bard, as we've already covered, and the Rogue is the other half of this comparison. A charismatic Bard and a charismatic Rogue can have identical charisma scores, identical proficiency in deception and persuasion, and even identical expertise in both. And they are doing something entirely different with that stat. The Bard's charisma is expressive. The performance is the point. When a Bard lies, they're giving a performance, and the lie is only part of what they're doing. They're also managing the emotional experience of the mark, controlling the atmosphere of the interaction, making the story they're telling feel true in a way that goes beyond the specific content of the words. The Bard sells the feeling, and the facts come along for the ride. A Bard who fails a deception check failed the performance. The timing was off, the emotion didn't land, something in the delivery gave them away. The Rogue's charisma is instrumental. It's a tool, like a lockpick or a grappling hook. Useful, precise, deployed when needed and put away when not. When a Rogue lies, they're solving a specific problem, getting through this door, past this guard, out of this situation. The lie is constructed to be structurally sound rather than emotionally compelling. It doesn't need to feel true, it just needs to be difficult to disprove in the 30 seconds before the rogue is somewhere else entirely. It's a distraction. A rogue who fails a deception check made a logical error. The cover story they made had a hole in it. The alibi didn't hold up. They underestimated what the target already knew. The Mastermind Rogue makes this distinction especially clear. The Mastermind's toolkit, impersonation, accent mimicry, social infiltration, is pure tradecraft. There's no artistry to it beyond the artistry of function. They don't charm you, they construct a version of reality that you have no immediate reason to doubt, and there's somewhere else before you find a reason. The Swashbuckler is the rogue subclass that most blurs this line because Swashbuckler charisma has a genuine flair to it. The panache ability, theatrical combat style, the sense that this character is performing even when they're not trying to deceive anyone. But even here, the charisma is this in service of a practical goal, maintaining mobility, controlling the battlefield, keeping the target's attention exactly where the rogue wants it. The performance is the instrument, not the point. A bard with deception expertise is an actor. A rogue with that same ability is a spy. Same scene, same lie, completely different relationship to it. And you'll see the difference the moment something goes wrong. So, we've established what charisma is, where it came from, what each score actually means, and how different classes express it differently. Now let's talk about what happens when charisma sits alongside other high or low stats, because the score doesn't exist in isolation, it exists in combination. And these combinations produce some of the most interesting and dramatically rich character concepts in the game. We'll focus on the mental stats since they share the same space. The head, the self, the interior life of the character. Wisdom coming in, intelligence, processing, charisma going out. When those three are out of balance, something interesting happens. So, low charisma and high intelligence first. This combination has a specific tragedy to it. Perfect analysis, imperfect delivery. This character understands the situation completely. They know exactly what needs to be said. They can see the optimal social outcome from 3 moves away, and they cannot make it happen because the gap between their internal clarity and their external expression is unbridgeable. They watch someone else fumble a negotiation they could have resolved in 30 seconds, and they have no way to intervene It doesn't make things worse. The interesting thing about playing this combination is resisting the temptation to make it purely comedic. Yes, there's comedy in the genius who can't talk to people, but the more honest version of this character has a specific kind of frustration that runs really deep. The experience of being consistently underestimated, of having your ideas ignored when you present them and then they're credited to someone else with a higher charisma party member represents them 5 minutes later. They're not funny. That's the kind of thing that shapes a person over years. High intelligence characters with low charisma often develop compensatory strategies that are worth building into the character concept. Written communication is a strength, where they can draft and revise rather than perform in real time, operating through intermediaries, finding someone with the social fluency they lack and supplying the analysis that person needs to be effective. Or simply retreating from social engagement almost entirely and becoming very, very good at things that don't require charisma. The wizard who corresponds exclusively by letters, the artificer whose creations speak for them, the scholar who's published extensively and met almost nobody. Boy, that strikes close to home. Low charisma and high wisdom is a different kind of isolation, and in some ways, a lonelier one. Where the low charisma, high intelligence character struggles to deliver what they know, the low charisma, high wisdom character struggles to deliver what they perceive. This is the character who reads people with uncanny accuracy, who knows the guard is lying, knows the merchant is afraid, knows the party's plan is going to go badly wrong before anyone else has spotted the problem, and they cannot communicate any of that in a way that lands. The prophet nobody listens to, the ranger who trusts the forest completely and struggles to explain why, the monk whose stillness reads as coldness, whose precision reads as indifference, whose insight arrives in the conversation as bluntness and is ignored because the diplomatic packaging requires charisma scores they don't have. That makes this combination particularly poignant in that high wisdom includes the insight skill, the ability to read others accurately. So this character is not unaware of what they're landing. They can see in real time that the person they're talking to has stopped listening. They can read the exact moment when their advice is dismissed. They watch it happen and lack the tools to prevent it. That's a specific and uncomfortable experience that most players never think to build into low charisma characters because they're too busy playing the awkward comedy version. The combination of the charisma with both high intelligence and high wisdom is frankly the most isolated archetype in the game. This character understands the world with unusual clarity and depth. They see patterns others miss, read people accurately, process information quickly, and have excellent judgment, and they exist in a state of near total social disconnection from the world they understand so well. The temptation with this combination is to play it as arrogance, the character who holds everyone else in contempt because they're clearly the smartest person in the room. The more interesting version is the character who has accepted, with some wariness, that the connection between understanding something and being able to communicate that understanding to another person is not guaranteed. They're not contemptuous, they're just tired. They've stopped expecting to be understood and have built a life around that expectation. This is the combination that produces great advisors and terrible leaders. People who can see exactly what needs to happen and have no ability to make others follow them there, and history is full of them. Now, let's go the other way. High charisma and low intelligence is one of the most entertaining combinations at the table and one of the most dangerous combinations in the fiction. The silver-tongued fool, the con artist who doesn't entirely know that they're running a con, the character who says the right thing without understanding the implications of what they've said, agrees to things they haven't fully understood and processed, charms their way through consequences that would stop a more self-aware person cold. They move fast, they commit completely, and they figure it out later. Or they don't, and they charm their way out of that too. What's worth playing seriously underneath the comedy is the vulnerability of this character. High charisma means people trust them, follow them, invest in them emotionally. Low intelligence mean they are genuinely not equipped to honour that trust consistently. They're not malicious. That's the important distinction. A high charisma, low intelligence character who is also evil is a different and darker thing. but the default version is someone who means well, inspires genuine loyalty, and periodically causes significant damage through their failure to think things through. The people who love them have complicated feelings about that. High charisma and low wisdom is the combination that produces the most compelling villains and the most frustrating party members, often simultaneously. Where low intelligence produces the charming fool, low wisdom produces the charming, reckless person. This character isn't failing to understand the consequences of the actions, they're failing to pause long enough to consider them. High charisma means they can recover from almost anything socially. Low wisdom means they consistently need to. They make promises in the heat of the moment that their future self will have to honour. They read the immediate emotional temperature of a room perfectly and completely miss the longer arc of what's developing. They are magnetic in the present sense and somewhat catastrophic in the future sense. The interesting roleplay territory is the aftermath. The character's usually genuinely remorseful that things go wrong. They're not sociopathic, just impulsive. But remorse doesn't undo consequences, and over the course of a campaign, the gap between their intentions and the impact can become a genuine source of dramatic tension. The party trusts them because they're compelled and compelling, warm and genuinely caring. The party also knows from experience not to let them make unilateral decisions. High charisma, with both low intelligence and low wisdom, is the combination that produces, depending on your sympathies, either the most lovable or the most alarming character concept available. This is pure force of personality, no breaks, no map, complete confidence. The character operates entirely on instinct and presence, and their instincts are social rather than analytical. They read the emotional moment perfectly and respond to it without any of the processing that intelligence and wisdom would otherwise provide. They are, in a very specific sense, all output. Everything goes outward, there is very little internal deliberation happening. At low levels, this produces comedy, the lovable disaster, the enthusiastic chaos agent whose plans are held together entirely by confidence and luck. At higher levels, played seriously, it becomes something more troubling, because high-level charisma with no moderating intelligence or wisdom is the mechanical profile of the demagogue, the cult leader, the beloved fool who has accumulated genuine power and influence without developing any of the judgment required to use it responsibly. They're not malicious, they don't need to be. The damage is structural. There's one more worth naming, and it doesn't fit neatly into the stat combination framework. The high charisma character who is acutely aware of their own magnetism and finds it alienating. This isn't a stat combination in the mechanical sense. It's a roleplayer layer that can fit on top of any high charisma build, but it's one of the richest available, and it connects directly back to everything we've established about charisma actually. If charisma is relational, if it exists in the gap between you and another person, then a character with very high charisma has a particular problem. The gap never closes. Everyone responds to the presence rather than the person. Everyone projects. Everyone has a version of you in their head that you didn't put there and can't entirely correct. The high charisma character who has noticed this and sits with it, who wonders occasionally whether anyone in their life is responding to them specifically or just the force of personality that precedes them everywhere they go. It's doing something genuinely interesting with that stat. The mechanical advantage is obvious. The cost is what makes it worth playing. Which brings us to the low charisma side of that question, because there's more to play here than most tables ever find. Low charisma gets treated as a joke at most tables. The awkward dwarf, the blunt half-orc, the wizard who forgets that other people have feelings. It's played for laughs, and then quietly ignored for the rest of the session because nobody wants to roleplay being bad at talking to people for 4 hours, which is understandable, but it leaves a significant amount of dramatic territory completely unexplored. Because the interesting question about low charisma isn't, how do I fail social skills interestingly? It's, who is this person, and how have they built a life around this? Let's start with something that comedy version never addresses. The character with low charisma has, in most cases, had low charisma their entire life. This isn't a temporary condition or a skill they haven't developed yet. It's a fundamental feature of how they move through the world, and the world has been responding to it since their childhood. That shapes the person in ways that are specific enough to be worth building into a character. There are two broad ways a person responds to a lifetime of social friction, and they produce very different characters. The first is compensation. The character has spent years developing workarounds for the gap between who they are and what the world responds to. They over-prepare for social situations, scripting conversations in advance, rehearsing arguments, arriving with written proposals because they know their verbal delivery will undermine their ideas if they wing it. They've learned which situations to avoid and which intermediaries to cultivate. They built systems around their limitation the way a person with a physical limitation builds access routes through a world that wasn't designed for them. This version of low charisma produces characters with a particular kind of quiet competence. They are never spontaneous in social situations because spontaneity has burned them too many times. They're never casual because casual requires a confidence in your own reception that they just don't have. But within their compensatory systems, they can be remarkably effective. The advisor who always sends memos rather than speaking in council. The commander whose battle plans are so thoroughly documented that nobody needs to be inspired by them. They're just briefed. The second response is withdrawal. The character tried for long enough and stopped. Not out of self-pity necessarily, more out of a rational cost-benefit analysis that concluded that the effort wasn't worth the return. They built a life that requires as little social navigation as possible and have become genuinely good at that life. This is the hermit wizard, the ranger who prefers the company of animals, the artificer whose workshop is the only place they feel entirely at home. Social interaction hasn't disappeared from their life, it's just been minimized to the point where it no longer generates significant friction because that's simply not enough of it to cause problems. What's worth playing in this version is that the withdrawal isn't experienced as deprivation. The character is not secretly yearning for connections while performing contentment. They have genuinely recalibrated. The loneliness, if it's there at all, is so familiar that it no longer registers as loneliness at all. It's just the background condition of their existence. It's actually harder to play than obvious isolation. And there's a third version that doesn't get named often enough. The low charisma character who has internalized their social disconnection as their identity. Not as a wound they carry or a limitation they compensate for, but as something they've incorporated into their self-concept so thoroughly that it no longer feels like a problem. They're not a social person. They have never been a social person. They do not experience this as a deficiency any more than a colorblind person experiences their vision as broken. It's simply how they perceive the world. They built an entire functional life within that perception. This character tends to be quietly baffled by the amount of energy other people invest in social performance. The politics, the positioning, the careful management of impressions. From where they stand, it looks exhausting and faintly absurd. They're not contemptuous of it exactly, they just genuinely don't understand why it matters as much as it apparently does to everyone else, which can make them oddly refreshing to be around in small doses, and somewhat challenging in the larger ones. Now, there's a specific interaction worth addressing that comes up constantly in actual play and almost never gets discussed seriously. The low charisma character who is also the most honest person in the party. High charisma enables deception, performance, and the smooth management of how you're perceived. Low charisma, particularly when combined with high wisdom and high intelligence, often produces a character who is constitutionally incapable of social lubrication that most people apply automatically to their interactions. They say what they think. They respond to what's actually happening rather than what the social convention of the moment requires them to pretend is happening. They tell the king that his plan is bad when every other advisor in the room is nodding along. Not because they're brave, but because the alternative, performing agreement they don't feel, simply doesn't occur to them as a viable option. This makes them, paradoxically, enormously valuable in exactly the situation where low charisma seems most problematic. The diplomatic negotiation where everyone else is performing. The royal court where the truce is being managed so carefully for so long that nobody remembers what it is. The moment that where somebody needs to say the thing that nobody with social sense would say, and the low charisma character says it, and it lands. Not because they deliver it well, but because it's so obviously true that even the awkward delivery can't undermine it. This tends to produce some of the most memorable character moments of any campaign precisely because it's unexpected. You don't see it coming from the character who failed their last 3 persuasion checks. There's also the question of how low charisma interacts with saving throw functions we discussed earlier. The charisma is selfhood argument, and here things get genuinely interesting. A character with a low charisma has a thin sense of self in the mechanical language of the game. They're more susceptible to banishment, possession, and effects that attempt to overwrite their identity, which, if you're playing the compensation or withdrawal version of this character, creates a specific and uncomfortable irony. The person who spent their entire life building a careful system around their social limitations is also the person most vulnerable to having their self erased entirely by the right kind of supernatural attack. Their defenses face outward. The thing that can actually undo them comes from a completely different direction. In the right moment, against the right threat, this is one of the most dramatically resonant things that can happen in a campaign. Not something to lean in on every session, but worth having in your back pocket, because it makes the thing that they've quietly managed their whole life, the fragility of their connection to other people, and turns it into a fragility of connection to themselves. Because before we close out, there's one more topic we promised to address at the top of this video, the question of charisma and physical attraction. Because this is where a lot of tables gets confused, and where some genuinely interesting cross-species roleplay questions arise, and the rules handle less elegantly than they might. How does charisma work for attraction when 2 different species are involved? It sounds like it should have a simple answer, but it doesn't. First, let's establish what charisma is not doing when it comes to attraction. Charisma is not a universal beauty score. We've already traced how the editions have progressively moved away from that reading, from Gygax's original 3-part definition of attractiveness, persuasiveness, and magnetism, through 2nd edition's deliberate softening, to 5th edition's near complete removal of appearance from the official definition. The optional comeliness stat from the Unearthed Arcana was the one serious attempt to give physical beauty its own dedicated number, and it didn't survive into mainstream play. So physical attractiveness, in the raw rules as written of most editions, is at best a contributing factor to charisma rather than its primary meaning. But it's clearly there somewhere. A charisma 18 character is not just persuasive and commanding. There's an implication of presence that includes, for most humanoid species, something that reads as appealing or striking in physical terms. The question is how that maps across species boundaries. And here the rules essentially throw up their hands and leave it to the table, which is actually the honest answer when you think about it, because physical attraction is not a universal constant. It's a species-specific, culture-specific, and individual-specific evaluation, which reads what reads as striking or beautiful to a human is not necessarily what reads as striking or beautiful to a dwarf, an elf, a dragonborn, or a mind flayer. The features that signal health, genetic fitness, or aesthetic appeal differ between species in ways that are genuinely incommensurable. A human face, evaluated by human standards, has nothing to say about what a Githzerai finds appealing. So, what is charisma actually measuring across species lines? The answer is presence. Not beauty, presence. The quality that the reaction roll in basic D&D was measuring. Perceived trustworthiness, authority, gut level assessment that this creature is worth dealing with. That quality is not species specific in the same way that physical beauty is. A high charisma character of any species produces a response in most other creatures that bypasses the specific cultural framework of physical attraction and operates at something more fundamental. The sense that this entity is significant, that they matter, and that engagement with them is worth the risk. This is why a high charisma half-orc and a high charisma half-elf both can be compelling to the same NPC, even though the specific physical features of that of each of them brings that interaction in completely different direction and is evaluated by completely different aesthetic standards. What the NPC is responding to isn't the face, it's the force behind it. Physical attraction, specifically the question of whether a character is appealing to members of other species in a romantic or sexual sense, is a different matter entirely, and one the rules decline to mechanize. That's a roleplay question, a setting question, and a fundamental question of the table. The rules can tell you that a character has a charisma 16, they can't tell you what a dwarf finds attractive in an elf, or whether a tiefling's infernal features read as striking or unsettling to a halfling. Those are questions of culture, individual taste, and the specific fictional world you're playing in. Charisma creates a condition for attraction. What happens next is entirely up to the table. There's a related question that comes up less often, but is worth addressing. How does charisma interact with creatures that don't experience social reality in humanoid terms at all? Undead, constructs, certain aberrations, creatures whose psychology is so different from the humanoid baseline that the normal social toolkit simply doesn't apply. The rules handle this through immunity. Many such creatures are immune to the charmed condition, which is the mechanical expression of charisma-based influence in most cases. But immunity to charm is not quite the same as immunity to charisma entirely. A vampire, for instance, is immune to being charmed, but a vampire with high charisma is one of the most dangerous social actors in the game, because they combine full force of the stat with the absence of any moral constraints that normally govern how it's used. A lich doesn't experience charisma in the way a living creature does, but a lich that was a powerful and charismatic individual in life has, in many settings, retained something of that presence, transformed by undeath into something colder and more absolute. The most interesting case is a creature that doesn't experience charisma at all, the construct, the mindless undead, the elemental. These beings respond to strength, to fire, to being commanded by someone with the right spell or the right authority. Charisma is simply inert to them, and there's something worth playing in the high charisma character who encounters for the first time something that doesn't respond to them. The presence that has shaped every social interaction of their life produces nothing. No reaction, no adjustment, just a flat, functional assessment of an entity that doesn't have the architecture to care. For a character who has come to rely on their charisma as their primary mode of engaging with the world, that encounter with genuine non-response is worth pausing on. It's not the sting of a failed persuasion check, it's stranger. The first time the thing they are has had no purchase on reality whatsoever. Now, we've covered a lot of ground in this video. Whew. Let's bring it home. We started this video with a simple triangle. Wisdom in, intelligence processing, charisma out. And that's not wrong. It's a useful shorthand for players who need a quick orientation. But by now you can see how much it leaves out. Charisma is the only attribute that requires an audience. Every other stat describes what you can do in isolation. Strength lifts a boulder, intelligence solves the puzzle, constitution endures the poison. Charisma only exists in relation to something else. It is, at its core, the stat that describes yourself as it appears to the world. And as we've seen, this has implications that run considerably deeper than whether you're good at talking to people. It's the wargaming leader mechanic that became a personality score. A reaction roll that could diffuse a fight before initiative was rolled. The innate force that flows through sorcerers and paladins, not because they've studied it, but because it's inseparable from who they are. And the saving throw that determines whether you remain yourself when something vast and terrible tries to overwrite you. And it's the number on the character sheet that most players halve, subtract 5 from, and quietly forget about. The decision makes sense if you're optimizing for a combat output. It makes considerably less sense once you understand what you're actually discarding. A low charisma score isn't just a tax on social skills, it's a statement about how thin your character's sense of self is, how easily overwritten, how permeable to the kind of supernatural pressure that the game's most dangerous creatures specialize in applying. Dumping charisma is a legitimate choice. It should just be a conscious one. On the other side of that, the players who invest in charisma and then play it as nothing more than a persuasion bonus are leaving most of that stat on the table. The score you choose has a texture to it, a specific way of moving through social space, a specific relationship to attention and influence and the people who orbit you. A Charisma 17 Paladin and a Charisma 17 Warlock are doing something fundamentally different with the same number, and both of them are doing something different, again, from the Charisma 17 Rogue, who has learned to use that magnetism as a precision instrument rather than a broadcast signal. The character combinations we went through aren't just interesting concepts in the abstract, they generate specific dramatic tensions that sustain across an entire campaign. The person who understands everything and can communicate nothing, the leader whose certainty is genuinely inspiring and genuinely dangerous, the charming disaster who means well and causes harm anyway. Those tensions don't resolve, they develop, and a character built around one of them has somewhere to go over the course of a long game in a way that a character built around a combat optimization often doesn't. And somewhere above all of that is the question of what happens when charisma exceeds what a mortal frame can contain, when presence stops being a quality and becomes a condition of the room. You don't encounter that often at most tables, but understanding it changes how you run the creatures that possess it. Tiamat doesn't need a script, she needs a presence. The difference between a memorable encounter with an ancient dragon and a forgettable one is often just whether the DM understands what a Charisma 28 actually means in the room. So, take another look at your character sheet, not at the modifier, at the number. Think about what it means for how this person has moved through their life, what it costs them, what it gives them, what it makes impossible. Think about whatever the class you choose expresses that charisma through craft, or inheritance, or conviction, or ambiguity. Think about what sits alongside it, whether the intelligence or wisdom scores create friction or alignment with that outward force of self. That's the game underneath the game. And charisma, more than any other stat, is where it lives. We've covered intelligence and now charisma, so the next complete attribute guide will be on wisdom. These take me a little while to research, as you can see, so bear with me. My name is AJ Pickett, your sage of Candlekeep, the original lore video dungeon tuber, the secret weapon of dungeon masters, and soothing storyteller for long drives and winding down before descending into the realm of dreams. As always, thank you very much for sticking with me. I know there was a lot to absorb in this video, but you don't come to me for clickbait and bullshit. So thanks for listening, and as always, I'll be back with more for you very soon.